Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Public Citizen is a U.S. Consumer organization. We have been tracking and following the issues of trade and services for many years as well, and are pleased to have the opportunity to be a part of this distinguished panel. I think my presentation follows quite nicely on the introduction, particularly as you were discussing the expansion of the financial services sector, and particularly the financial services sector not really investing in the real economy. And I think that was one of the lessons from the global financial crisis. And so I would like to, my presentation, I'd like to briefly talk about the lessons for how to promote a robust, well-regulated financial sector, discuss some of the contradictions that exist between current trade agreements and trade and investment rules that we're concerned will be replicated and deepened in the TISA, and what some of those implications might be for global financial stability. Just in terms of why governments may choose to liberalize their financial services sector, I mean, there are some of the reasons that are often cited is that liberalizing and opening a financial services sector to foreign investment can improve countries' access to capital, lower prices for consumers, recapitalize failing domestic firms, or transfer technology and skills. These are potential benefits. However, if left unregulated, liberalization of the financial services sector can lead to dangerous instability, which we have learned over the years, not just in the most recent financial crisis, but financial markets are not essentially stable. And according to the Bank of International Settlements, during the previous 25 years before the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, 93 countries suffered a total of 117 systemic disturbances, 51, an average of 6 per year. So financial markets need regulation, and we all know, and particularly given the deep recession that happened after the global financial crisis, what the real impacts on the real economy are in terms of unemployment, in terms of washing away development gains in countries where the crisis did not originate, but faced serious consequences of that crisis. It's now a pretty broad consensus that a financial deregulation in the years and the decades prior to the financial crisis was one of the causes. Of failure of regulation led to excessive risk-taking by banks, and basically created a shadow banking system. Their unregulated capital flows left developing countries vulnerable to financial contagion, particularly as capital flows tend to be pro-cyclical. And it's fairly uncontested that the consensus coming out of that crisis was that financial markets, they need rules, they need limits, they need clear surveillance in order to make sure that the market failures that happen are less frequent and less costly to the general public. So what I'd like to shift to now is a discussion about what are some of the concerns that trade and finance experts have raised in the past years, particularly in the context of the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which is obviously the basis for the TISA. As Deborah mentioned at the beginning, the push behind the GATS was large financial industry, particularly in the United States, and this was negotiated during the early 1990s, during a period of mass deregulation, and 80s and 90s. Therefore, the rules are therefore of concern. More than 100 of WTO members at the time took financial services commitments. Many developing countries were concerned and did not take as strong commitments, but many developing countries did take commitments in financial services. And in the Doha round, the requests on services pushed for further liberalization under the current rules, and with concern, we're not recognizing lessons from the crisis. Just to mention that some of the issues that I will raise in terms of what the conflicts may be have been recognized by the UN Stiglitz Commission of Experts following the financial crisis. Also, UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report from 2011 made mention of the concerns related to financial services, financial regulation, capital controls, and trade and investment agreements. So just very briefly, once again, our concern is that in the GATS, in the market access rules, we're not just talking about discriminatory measures. They conflate liberalization and certain types of deregulation. So, for example, under the market access rules in committed sectors, there's a prohibition on bans of financial services or products, so such as toxic derivatives or types of trading in commodities. If a country believes that they need to ban a certain product or service, that is considered to be a zero quota under the WTO rules, and even if it affects domestic and foreign firms the same amount. Similarly, there's a prohibition on size limits on entities, so that could have implications for too big to fail regulations that are being considered and undertaken. There's a prohibition on requirements of the legal form for a service, so that can include important regulations around putting in firewalls to protect depositors from investment banking. So all of these types of regulations could be implicated and caught under the market access rules. Similarly, in the rules that are related to transfers or the free flow of capital transfers in a service that is committed, there's a prohibition on restrictions on capital flows. This may make some sense in some sectors, but in the financial services sector, it's actually potentially destabilizing flows that constitute the service themselves. And so this implicates capital controls that are intended to protect stability from destabilizing hot money flows or asset bubbles. And we know in the years since the GATS was negotiated that there is a change in the consensus on capital controls. The IMF has an institutional view now that recognizes capital controls as a legitimate policy tool. And many of the efforts to institute a financial transactions tax, et cetera, in Europe. In 2010, there was a European Commission staff paper itself that noted potential conflicts between such an FTT and GATS commitments and rules. Now, we're always the answer to this is always that there is a prudential carve-out in the GATS. Unfortunately, as lawyers have looked carefully at this, and a carve-out is a term of art, and this is not a carve-out. The prudential measure, Article 2A of the Financial Services Annex, is an exception, a defense that can be raised by a country if they've been challenged. So their measures can be challenged under the GATS in the first instance, and it has a very ambiguous second sentence, which may sound familiar to some of the things we've heard earlier around public services, where such measures do not conform with the provisions of agreement, they shall not be used as a means of avoiding the parties' commitments, obligations under the provisions. So the only reason you would need to raise the exception is if you had violated the agreement. So there is concern around whether, post-crisis, is it time to consider how you revising or clarifying what this prudential exception means to protect the policy space that's needed. And similarly, for capital controls, there is an exception for balance of payments crises, but this only allows for short-term capital controls. It doesn't allow for prophylactic capital controls to protect from destabilizing inflows, et cetera. So in the context of the WTO members in the past several years have raised concerns about these rules. In 2011, member state Barbados tabled a paper raising some of these concerns. Ecuador was later supported by many developing countries in calling for a review of the rules. There was unfortunately, this was blocked by the U.S. and EU. Initially, there was a dedicated discussion held in the WTO last year to discuss how macroprudential measures are undertaken to safeguard stability. So this has been an issue of concern among WTO members. Now, moving to the TISA, which is obviously what's relevant here today, is that there are further concerns. We assume that the GATS will form the basis, and that's been our assumption, of the TISA. There have been many attempts to try to learn lessons from the crisis, and those who are promoting the TISA, the U.S. and EU, have not been willing to have that conversation in the WTO. So there are concerns about those rules within the context of TISA. In addition, as we've mentioned before, negative lists for national treatment will have concerns because for many of the developing countries that did not take extensive commitments, they now will have to schedule only exceptions for national treatment. The standstill on current levels of regulation, as we've discussed before, obviously has huge implications for financial regulation, particularly as the ink has not even dried on some of the important regulations in my country, in the U.S., and obviously in Europe. It's a process underway as well. The further disciplines on domestic regulation that Ellen was discussing earlier, again, has huge and concerning implications for financial regulators as if they have to undertake multiple necessity tests or trade impact analysis of regulations that are meant for financial stability. They are to try to protect the public should be the first indication of the types and consumers for financial regulation. And given that in U.S. FTAs there has not even been the insufficient balance of payments exception for capital controls, there is a concern that the TISA could even eliminate that even that insufficient exception for developing countries. We know, for example, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. has continued to have that position, and that has been a contested issue in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What was also discussed earlier is that we do have a little more now indication of what is being pursued in the TISA. There was one annex that was leaked by WikiLeaks in June of this year, and what some of the implications that came from that does, unfortunately, in our view, suggest that our concerns are quite valid in the TISA. First of all, it's clear from the leaked draft that it is the U.S. and EU who are the most active in proposing text for the financial services annex. Those are the countries that, some of them that were active in not wanting to have this conversation in the WTO and are aware that the financial services industries that we know are pushing this. And I should mention that the financial services industry has been very vocal in the U.S. that this is one of the top priorities for TISA, is further liberalization of financial services. The text that leaked shows that the understanding on commitments of financial services, which is currently a voluntary agreement within the WTO, which serves as much more extensive rules for GATS and extensive and includes the negative list, et cetera, does serve as the basis for the TISA text, which again does not include a rethink post-crisis. And the leaked text also showed that it replicated the same problematic prudential exception in the concerns that I raised before from the financial crisis. I should mention that the new financial services that would be are implicated to be automatically accepted for the future, to be bound under the rules and in the leaked chapter, and I think that that could have implications for what's being thought of in other sectors as well within the TISA. We've already discussed the standstill and the cross-border data flows, that governments can lose the right to require data to be held onshore. This could have implications for, obviously, for sensitive financial data. And there's a provision in the leaked text that it's under the heading of transparency, but what concerns that we have from the U.S. context, and we understand that the U.S. is proposing this, the language in various agreements, would be that it could provide avenues for the financial services industry to be able to intervene and influence at very early stages of regulation and rulemaking, to influence, challenge, and delay regulations. This has definitely been the case in the context of our own re-regulation in the U.S. under Dodd-Frank. Many of those rules have been very delayed as the industry has engaged in delay tactics and forcing comments and et cetera. So to conclude here, and I'm happy to answer any questions, we have very detailed analyses about all of the provisions that I mentioned that we can make available if people are interested, and we have a fact sheet in the back that has an overview. But I think in terms of the implications and the questions that should be asked is, why would countries seek to deepen liberalization commitments, particularly in financial services, if we're operating under deregulatory rules that were negotiated during a period of deregulation, and they have not been fixed or revised or clarified to ensure that governments have the needed space for regulation. And this, if that is the case, then such a project in TISA really does or would contradict efforts elsewhere in the G20 and Basel that have been moving toward really trying to encourage much more robust regulation. And so we don't want trade negotiators going in one area when regulators in other international fora are going in the other. And I think that that has huge implications, obviously not just for TISA countries, but the entire globe knows that if one country is not able to regulate its financial services sector, that can have implications for everybody, given how interconnected global financial flows are. So there's more information at the website that I mentioned here, and I welcome questions later. Thank you.